Welcome to the show. The driving energy behind any community development is built with the kinds of professionals that invest their time and their interest into seeing lives become better in our neighborhoods. Today, we're going to talk to one of those individuals who has put passion and a commitment to helping others and to help bring about a better environment in which we can live in and to develop a future for those individuals that they work for. We're here today with Masiel Valentin, who is an attorney in our community. And Masiel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I thank you primarily because of the fact that your expertise is so overwhelming that it's very difficult for someone to just have an opportunity to have a conversation, I'm sure. And the relative opportunity is something that I want to continue to keep consistent, simply because my viewers need to have an input from someone of your caliber. You have grown here in the Newark area,
Yes.
All of your life. Why don't you share with us your history?
Okay. Well, actually, my parents came to Newark about in the 50s when the big migration came from Puerto Rico, and they set down their roots. They were local business owners and raised their three children here. I have an older sister, a younger brother. We lived here. Actually, I moved away very briefly because my father retired to Puerto Rico, but those 10 years that I lived in Puerto Rico actually helped me get in touch with my own roots. And then when I came back to Newark to go to law school, it really does help me connect with my client base, which is mostly Hispanic, but also with the Puerto Rican community here and bridging that space between the life of the Puerto Rican on the island, the life of the Puerto Rican here. And in my line of work with law, sometimes it's about explaining how the laws work here, how the laws work there. Sometimes you're dealing with issues of inheritance, which is quite complex in Puerto Rico. And I provide that bridge for them.
When it comes to economics and the relationship as we find in culture, it still has a line between black and white.
Yeah.
We had discussed this in one other taping that we had done, and I want to really share some more of that conversation in regard to how Puerto Rico is really established and what are the pitfalls in terms of its opportunity to become unified. We know that there's a terrible crisis in terms of economics there.
Yes.
Are you familiar with any of the development?
Yeah, well, right now we have a fiscal control board that's overseeing everything in the island because of the vulture funds, are the funds that are owed, that Puerto Rico has borrowed heavily. Unfortunately, Puerto Rico is subject to maritime laws that limit their being able to conduct commerce independently with other nations. That affects us significantly, and they are limited with regard to a lot of the tax breaks that the federal government used to allow businesses to reap the benefits of when they were established in the island. All those have been gone. They've been taken away since probably the late 90s, early 2000s, and what we're seeing is we're losing a lot of the manufacturing, we're losing a lot of the specialized areas, plus we have this really big debt just hanging over our heads. So they just recently filed for what it would be considered a bankruptcy, although Puerto Rico, because it's a commonwealth, can't access bankruptcy the same way that municipalities in the United States can. So we've got this really complex legal framework that they are trying to apply, but unfortunately what we're seeing is a lot of Puerto Ricans migrating in the thousands to the U.S.
How is poverty in relationship to the island and the contrast to what's happening with the migration?
Well, I can tell you just this morning I was having a conversation, something like 90% of the population on the island depends from the government program for health insurance coverage. This is what they call La Reforma in Puerto Rico, which I'm assuming the funding is coming somewhere from like Medicaid type funding. So 90% of them will be affected by these cuts that are being recommended now by the administration here in the U.S. But we do have a large proportion of people who are accessing college education, because college education is still very inexpensive compared to the cost here stateside. So what we're seeing is a lot of professionals migrating abroad. We have a lot of engineers, a lot of teachers, a lot of doctors that have left the island.
What about the common person?
The common person, we're getting laborers leaving also. I mean, They just enacted a law for people in their younger 20s that they've rolled back the minimum wage.
Wow.
So from the federal minimum wage, we're talking about something like $5 an hour. If you're in your early 20s, they can pay you less.
Right.
And their argument is that since the employers are paying less, they will now create more jobs because they can employ more people at a lower rate.
Right. Does
So
that make sense?
That's the nonsense they're dealing with.
Thinking about that in the context of how we are talking about the tremendous burden that's going on. And if you're tuning in, I'm Herb Glenn. I'm here with Masiel Valentin, who's an attorney here in our community, and you spend a lot of time in immigration and helping people who are migrating from Puerto Rico in particular, and how they can be able to navigate through their legal system.
Yeah, see, it's twofold, because I deal with immigration in the sense of actual immigrants who don't have a green card, and then we have the U.S. citizens coming from Puerto Rico don't have to deal with all of that, but deal with all the other implications of uprooting their life. So there's a social context to migration. They're immigrants in every other sense except the fact that Puerto Ricans are born U.S. citizens.
That's interesting.
So I deal heavily with Puerto Ricans.
But if they're born U.S. citizens, why would there be a need for a green card?
No, because I deal a lot, we've spoken about my background, I deal a lot with immigration for the non-Puerto Rican Latinos as well.
So the Puerto Rican, okay, so the Puerto Rican Latino doesn't have to be concerned about the immigration issue here per
Correct.
se.
Yes.
But there are still some nuances that they have to adhere to when they transition over.
The social transition. So they have the immigrant experience in every other aspect, language, culture, except the legal status. But then I do also deal heavily with the non-Puerto Rican Latino community in helping them attain legal status.
Do they get mixed up in this whole debacle about immigration reform?
It's really funny. I'm Puerto Rican myself. My husband is a non-Puerto Rican Latino. He's from Costa Rica. So we have that experience at home, and I've lived it from both aspects. And unfortunately, sometimes within the Puerto Rican community, there isn't that sympathy or affinity for the topic of immigration status because they haven't lived it themselves. There are a great many other activists that are Puerto Rican, but you do see a bit of a gap between, well, that's your experiences and it's not mine.
Thinking about the relationship of Puerto Rico and how it affects the lifestyles of individuals who are migrating over, in terms of looking now at the issue, whereas people are confused, Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, the whole idea that because you speak a certain cultural language, that you have to be part of that class.
Yeah.
The complexity of it must be overwhelming, especially now with the type of hardship that's being created for individuals who have a hard time communicating in this country. How is it effective in regard to finding ways to communicate to individuals that are in a situation where they have a problem becoming a legal citizen and developing a method of being able to trust someone that is going to help them overcome that barrier?
I mean, in my situation as an immigration attorney, when they come to me, the first thing I do is the language. Language is a huge issue. Luckily, I told you I lived 10 years in Puerto Rico, so my language skills are, university, high school, junior high. My language skills in Spanish are probably better than my language skills in English. And that's a very good connection. Sometimes you come to an attorney who perhaps speaks Spanish here, but not the best Spanish. And there's always that bit of doubt. Well, he's not communicating effectively. Does that reflect on their professional capacity versus just the fact that they don't manage the language well? So the fact that I can speak the language does help me bridge that gap with them and inspire a certain level of not only respect, but trust. The fact that I have also gone through that process, navigated that process within my own family because my husband went through the system to acquire his status also creates a certain affinity between me and my clients. And I guess the other step is just constantly explaining and making sure that the client understands. I think the biggest problem we have in immigration now is that most people will say, yeah, there's something you can do and this is what it's called and this is how much it's going to cost you. I've made it my mission to go out into the community. I'm invited a lot. Different churches and other organizations invite me out into the community. I do Know Your Rights workshops. In fact, tomorrow night I'm working with Newark Public Schools. Yet again, we did a series of workshops through Newark Public Schools just to explain what people's rights are, whether they are citizens who speak Spanish versus non-citizens or undocumented immigrants, knowing what their basic legal rights are. And I take it from there. In the community and in that consultation in my office, I make sure that they don't leave until they fully understand how the law applies to them.
That's interesting, because a number of individuals, like you say, are hacked. Yeah. You know, they go to someone who understands the system, and they give them a lot of money, and they still get no result from what it is that they are trying to pay for. What are some of the basic properties that are necessary for a person who has to deal with immigration and to get through the system?
Listen, the first thing I always tell them is know how the system works here. Know that unlike our home countries where a notary is a higher level of an attorney, in the U.S., a notary is just a person that's authorized to acknowledge signatures. They're not authorized to give legal advice. They don't have any special legal training. Make sure that when you are accessing people for advice, they are people who are qualified to give you that advice, that they are attorneys if you're going to nonprofits, that they are accredited to provide that service, because in the area of immigration, there's actually a whole accreditation process through the Department of Justice. If they are not accredited for a nonprofit to provide the service without that accreditation, it's illegal.
Wow.
So I teach them how to find the rosters of the accredited organizations, and I also teach them what to ask. And there's many resources online. Right now you can go online, plug in my name at the judiciary website for the state of New Jersey, and you will see when I obtained my license. You'll see that my status is active, and you can do that with people who are claiming to be attorneys. If it's not popping up, they're not an attorney. And you can go to the DOJ website and you access the nonprofit organizations, and you can see whether they're accredited, whether they're not accredited, or how long they've been accredited. If there have been complaints against those organizations, that accreditation can be revoked. So at least knowing to navigate the very beginning.
Right.
And then people also need to understand that the manner that they entered into the country counts, how long they've been here counts, whether they have family members or not. All of that is relevant to whether they can access some sort of legal remedy to their status. There's not any case that is identical to another. You could be siblings, you could have entered at the same time, and still your cases can be different.
Wow.
And as long as people come to my presentations and they understand that your case is different and you need to get advice specifically on your case, then I've accomplished something. Unfortunately, people think it's all cookie cutter.
Yeah.
One of the biggest misconceptions out there is if you've been here over 10 years and you have a U.S. citizen child, you can apply for a green card. It's not that easy. It's not that simple. Most of the scams that are being run are based on that quote-unquote 10-year law, which we call cancellation of removal, and can only be accessed if you're in the process of deportation, or what they now call removal.
What do you think is the most critical area that should be identified to when an individual comes to you for immigration issues?
They need to identify what the obstacles are to them obtaining status. And like I said, sometimes it just starts with how they entered the country. Someone who entered the country illegally is going to have a much harder time trying to obtain a green card in the country than someone who perhaps entered with a visa and overstayed. A person who enters with a visa can marry a U.S. citizen and get a green card. One who entered illegally, not necessarily. There's all these waivers.
But what I'm trying to get at, percentage-wise,
Yeah.
what is the real problem that happens more consistently?
Listen, I would say the biggest problem right now is the problem of unlawful presence. Anyone who has entered illegally or has entered legally but remained out of status for over a year would be subject to a 10-year bar when they leave the country. And in most cases, if you are here illegally, you would have to leave the country to apply for status. And most people don't understand how that works. There's exceptions, and they think since the other person had an exception, then I can qualify for the exception. And that's where everything gets really convoluted. And a lot of people don't know, this happened under Clinton. This was back in the mid-90s that this 10-year bar was enacted into law.
That's important that people can understand that there is a history behind it. And looking at it, from the perspective of identifying what those critical issues are is very important for a person of your caliber, and that you have the sensitivity to know how to deal with individuals. What's the difference between a Latino and a Hispanic?
The Latinos love to talk about this all the time. Hispanic means you speak Spanish. Latino means you come from one of the countries whose language derives from Latin. So generally speaking, Latinos would be all of Latin America, all of Central and South America. Hispanics would be that area except French Guiana, Brazil.
Really?
Because they don't speak Spanish predominantly. And I mean, I have colleagues who'll go into the history of the term Hispanic, that it was created because of the census, but basically it just comes down to that. Hispanic means of Spanish-speaking origin. Wow.
And thinking about it from that perspective, then, when you are dealing with immigration and they aren't Hispanic, it kind of leaves an open window, trying to understand exactly what their cultures are and what it is that they can be able to identify with.
It's really important to understand that cultural context. Language is really important. I do have clients from other backgrounds. Just recently I had someone, I'm not going to say the country from Africa because I can't recall off the top of my head, but I know they spoke French. And in that situation, the person is sitting there talking to me about a marriage case, but the spouse is not there. My bells and whistles are going off, marriage fraud. And I'm sitting there and listening. I understand a little French. So I was able to ascertain that it was in fact a marriage fraud case because they were speaking amongst themselves that he did not live with his spouse. So and that's really important because people don't understand that if you file a marriage fraud case, a case that's determined to be marriage fraud, you could be barred for life from receiving any sort of benefit.
Wow.
But generally speaking, you want to have an attorney that speaks your language so you can communicate effectively.
Now, you're here in Newark on Summer Avenue,
Yes.
And you've been there for a number of years working with the family law and areas in relationship to helping to represent people who are having municipal concerns.
Yes.
The idea of your challenge as you move forward, what do you think is going to be your future? What do you think you're going to be able to concentrate on in the next 5 years?
I would say family law and immigration are the two biggest areas. But then again, it's all intertwined because usually the person I'm helping with their immigration status is either getting married and they're obtaining their status through the marriage, which means we're dealing with family law issues, or they just got divorced and they need to make sure that they don't lose their green card, or they got the traffic ticket. So the three major areas are municipal court, family, and immigration. I see that to continue to grow. I mean, I do the occasional closing and things like that, but it's usually more about my clients wanting to accomplish the American dream. They want to start their business, they want to purchase a home, and they want to get their legal status, so they want to get their personal affairs in order.
You were just elected to the Latino American...
Yes, it's County Latino American Chamber of Commerce, yes.
And as an officer...
I am counsel to the board.
Building that kind of a relationship from a business perspective, how does that help make it effective in regard to the outreach that organization is trying to do?
Well, then again, when you're in the community and you're working with the community, the issues that affect them, it helps you better address their needs and better access them, reach them. So in my case, I have clients who are in my office who want my advice because they're starting a business, and I tell them, you know what, we're having a seminar, come on in and join us and we'll teach you from there. And then at the seminar, we're talking about I-9 issues because you need to make sure that people are properly documented to work, or you have the undocumented person who owns a business, and how do you go about filing your taxes so you comply with the law, even though technically speaking, you're not authorized to work in the country. So it's all intertwined.
You focus on a lot of those issues that deal with businesses that individuals who are of other cultures have been able to establish, and find that it has become a real burden to them to not know them.
Yeah.
And the I-9 issue is very intimate.
Yes.
And now it's become a real major problem simply because of the immigration concerns. Can you just touch a little bit on how an individual can be able to approach getting a better understanding of it, and what they need to do to establish an opportunity to correct it if they haven't?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are attorneys who will come in and they will do counseling. They will look at your records and explain to you what the requirements are. So basically, the I-9 is the form that we all have to fill out when we apply for a job. We have to prove that we're a U.S. citizen or a lawful permanent resident, then we have the permission to work. So usually provide a social security number, right? You apply for a job, they photocopy your social security card, they photocopy your birth certificate or your passport. A lot of these larger companies kind of fall through the cracks with regard to this process. They're not keeping it in their records. They could be fined for that. So we do an audit and we tell them, listen, this is your record keeping. This is what you need to do to not go astray of the law. But then we also deal with the people who are undocumented themselves and then usually have to incorporate, and through a corporate entity, they can now become employers. They can work because it's their own business and they become employers to people. Generally speaking, it should be people who are authorized to work, because if not, they're running afoul of the law in the sense that they're providing jobs for undocumented people. But it's just, we just invite them to seminars, explain the process, consulting services, come in, look at the records, show them what they're doing right, show them what they're doing wrong, explain to them what the penalties are, because it could be hundreds of dollars per form that are not in the file.
Well, you're very active and you're in our community. You've been politically involved and you're dealing with a number of areas that are important for our community. I certainly appreciate you giving us an opportunity to share with our viewers your expert opinion and the ways in which you can be able to share your knowledge so that they can have an effective life if they need any legal counseling.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Well, we certainly want to continue to have you part of our network, and I will not only be inviting you, but I will be supporting you in your efforts as you do outreach in the community, because it's very beneficial to me to cross over into a community that I don't have a consciousness of.
Yeah.
And you as an advocate is going to be very helpful in that regard.
I'll keep you informed.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
And we'll be looking forward to having another opportunity to speak with Masiel Valentin, who is located at 349 Summer Avenue, right? In
Yes.
the lower level of Newark, New Jersey. Thanks again,
Okay.
Masiel.
Thank you.
All righty.
Okay.
And thank you for tuning in.